Welcome to Logos Live. I'm Robert Martin, Director of the City Bible Forum in Melbourne, and I'm your host for the show. Logos is Greek for word or message, and Logos Live seeks to engage the Christian message before a live audience in the CBD of Melbourne. And do we have a live audience here today? Are they alive? Yes. We also aim to have a little bit of fun. Who said exploring the big questions of life shouldn't be enjoyable? Now, modern Australian culture is influenced by Christianity. The Christian message dominates the history of Western civilization, and the birth of Christianity can be traced to those first events in that first Easter week. Why is Easter so important? How could it be the week that changed the world? Today we're speaking with the Reverend Shane Rogerson. Shane's worked for a number of years in churches in coastal New South Wales and inner city Sydney. He's the lead pastor of St Matt's Anglican Church in Prahran. He loves life in Melbourne and can be often seen frequenting the best cafes in Prahran and the city. And Shane loves engaging people with the bigger questions of life. Please welcome Shane Rogerson.
Thank you.
Shane, welcome. You're a pastor of a church now, but you've not always been a Christian believer. Can you tell us a little bit about your story? What convinced you to be a follower of Jesus?
Sure, I'd love to. I've been a Christian quite some time now, but I did not grow up in a context of family where there was religious belief, although that has changed a little bit since I've become a Christian. I think whilst I was in a family of indifferent or apathetic people when it came to religious belief, in my teens and into my early 20s, I kind of had developed as a left-wing Marxist atheist.
Right. Okay, wow.
And
how did that manifest itself?
well...
Did you go marching, storming the city?
Yes, I wanted to burn the Reichstag and do all those things. No, it was interesting because middle-class Sydney is where I grew up. But I came from well, I'd say it was a working class background. So a single mum who married a guy with a degree, moved to the leafy suburbs, and we're kind of in that aspirational middle class existence, good school, safe environment.
And this is where you became a Marxist?
Yeah, well, the Hills District, I would never live there, but I have lots of friends and family who live there. It was quite common for people to, do religious education in school. Everyone went along, but I always really struggled with that. But I had some friends who were believing Christians, and not just culturally so. They actually were very serious about their faith. They wanted to share their faith with me, and there was a couple of extremely good-looking girls in particular who were interested in sharing their faith with me, and so I was very interested in exploring that with them.
So a left-wing Marxist atheist, what convinced you?
Well, I was actually I was more convinced of atheism having engaged with Christians to begin with.
Right.
So what I did is I explored Christianity. I was apathetic and indifferent myself. I explored the Christian faith with my friends, and I think I came to understand something of the logic of the Christian message. I understood kind of how it fitted together and how it explained the world. But fundamentally, I didn't like the idea of any other person running my life. I did, though, want a coherent worldview. And therefore, I had to go and find an alternative explanation. If Christianity wasn't going to be the thing, I thought, well, I'm going to find something alternate to Christianity which sort of answers some of the questions I had in life. And I ended up progressively moving towards the left politically and adopting socialism and then kind of more idealised forms of communism. But it was not the right time in world history to be doing that, because communists were losing, the wall was coming down, and I was trying to say, no, hold those bricks up! But what it did, it gave me a compelling worldview in terms of left-wing Marxism. It gave me something to fight for, but at the same time I could sleep with whoever I wanted to sleep with.
You felt it was a liberating worldview?
Well, it both gave you purpose, but it also gave you a sense of freedom at the same time, personally and morally. And so I rejected Christianity, I rejected Christian faith, and over about 2.5 years I continued to engage with my Christian friends, because the thing that I found quite annoying is that there was many ideals within the Christian community and the way they treated each other, which I found incredibly compelling. I just didn't think that Jesus had to be the centre of that.
So what changed?
In one sense, the wheels fell off for me personally and morally. Within an atheist worldview, I began to think a lot about what really gives meaning to what we're doing. Not only was the wall collapsing, but my own life was, in a sense, that project of autonomy was not working. Failed relationship, drug and alcohol issues, a sense of nihilism. What's the meaning? What's the purpose? If it all ends in death, life then is essentially chaotic. Then why do I bother? And that was crystallised for me with a Christian friend's father, a man called Douglas Orr, who was a scientist. And I can remember having a conversation with him where, he kind of asked the bigger questions of life and really said, Shane, what's the point of living if you think it all ends in death? And I said, well, there's justice and there's fighting for right and these things. And he sort of just ripped the carpet out on me a little bit and helped me to see that if things all end in death, whether I died yesterday or today or tomorrow, he just sort of said, what is life really worth? What is life really about if it all ends in death? And he graphically illustrated that for me. He said, Shane, what if if it all ends in death, and it doesn't really matter what we do now, and there is no right and wrong, there's just survival of the fittest or the fastest or the fattest. And he won on all three counts there. And he said, what if I was to go and grab my .22 out of the cupboard and shoot you? He said, what would that mean? You couldn't say it was right or wrong, it was evil or abhorrent. It's just I'm bigger and faster than you with the trigger. And as I began to explore that with him, he sort of showed me that my life would rot on the carpet, and if they left it there long enough, all the water would evaporate from it, and what would be left is a pile of chemicals and minerals, which he suggested he could bag up, take it to the local garden centre and get $5 for. And
so your life is worth $5.
Is your life worth $5? Was the question. And in the scale of things, that helped me to be much more honest about the moral framework that I was appealing to and the sense of purpose in life. And that really opened up a deeper question about the Christian worldview, the historical claims of Jesus, Christian hope, resurrection, etc.
It sounds like hope was a big factor in you considering the Christian message or the lack of hope in the alternatives.
Absolutely. In fact, it was the lack of hope in the alternative, which in a sense drove me to the edge of a cliff. And Douglas Orr very kindly drove me to the edge of the cliff and said, do you want to go there? And I said, well, just hang on, let's just take 2 steps back and think about alternatives at that point. But one of the things that was really helpful for me, I had problems with the historicity of the resurrection, which was absolutely central to the Christian faith. So the Apostle Paul says, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then your
faith is futile.
Your faith is futile. It's crazy. And so I knew that was central. But I heard a person say, even if you don't believe in resurrection, you should want it to be true. Because if everything ends in death, then everything that you might think is important, things like justice and care for the poor, and they really end the same way. They end in death. And so why bother fighting for those things? If in the end it all ends in death, why not just eat, drink and marry, for tomorrow we die? But even then I tried that and I still wasn't happy. And so that having come to sort of explore the hopelessness of facing death, I read a little bit of Tolstoy and those kind of things, so I thought I was doing it in a more philosophical way. But fundamentally, I just couldn't live that way. And I thought, well, I'm prepared to explore things like the historical basis for Christianity and see if there is actually something in this guy Jesus rising from death and the hope that apparently brought.
Okay, well, maybe we should do that. Yeah. To help us do that, I'm going to introduce someone. Some say that he's the only one who could possibly win a Pulitzer Prize for a poem about a howitzer. Well, at least he could make them rhyme. All we know is that he's Cam, award-winning poet and performer. Please welcome Cam Simmons.
Hi. Great, thanks. So, as is usual...
So do you think you could make a poem about a Pulitzer and a howitzer?
I'm sure I could. It just might not be very good. But today's Bible reading is from the book of Luke. It's chapter 24, and it's verses 1 to 12. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise." And they remembered his words. And returned from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words to them seemed as idle talk, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marvelling at what had happened. So I see one of the jobs as a poet is just to give new words and different words and fresh words to these familiar stories. You know, people think, oh, I'm a poet, I must rhyme all the time, but I'm actually not very good at rhyme. Like, I'm still not very good at rhyme, even though I've been writing for 20 years. What actually I realised I could do and I quite enjoyed doing was hardcore alliteration. So here's my account of the resurrection in R. Wrapped in rags, the Redeemer's remains rested in a rocky room. A round rock restricted all routes to the room. Now the ruling rabbis remembered the Redeemer's remarks regarding resurrection and realised the Redeemer's recruits might rob the Redeemer's remains and wrongly report the Redeemer as risen. Reactively, the ruling rabbis rostered a representative of the regiment to repel robbers. Now the Redeemer's recruits, ravaged by remorse, rested. But once rested, a remnant of these renegades rallied by the rocky room to ritually remedy the rank reek of the Redeemer's remains. And radically, the regimental representative remained rigid as a radiantly robed representative of righteousness removed the rock and remarked to the remaining recruits, "The Redeemer has risen." Repeat my remarks to the rest of the recruits. Run. Well, the Redeemer's recruits ran. And remarkably, the Redeemer rendezvoused with the rushing recruits, remarking, "Recruits, resist reluctance, return to the rest of the recruits and regroup at our regular rendezvous." Now the risen Redeemer reassured the reunited recruits of the reality of his return, revealing where his wrists had been ruptured, where the rod had been rammed, and the revelation that his red rivers ran to rescue every rascal and every reverend from the reach of the realm of the wretched. And the Redeemer's recruits responded with rousing revelry and rightful reverence.
Please thank Cam Salmons. Your comments on Cam's reflections?
I like the little phrase there, the rascals and the reverends alike. Because I think one of the challenges in the way that the gospel is often presented, it's seen as good news for rebellious and people who've wrecked their lives. And yet people who are seemingly righteous and upright and together, it can often sound like stop being that kind of rascal and start being a righteous person, rather than seeing whether you've kind of squandered your life or whether you're quite together in your life. You both need a relationship with God. So it's a beautiful expression.
So we'll consider the Redeemer's resurrection. You used to have objections against historical evidence for the resurrection. What changed your mind?
Well, sure, I was terrible at school, but I did have one of the best ancient historians that could ever grace the public school education system. So my teacher was absolutely brilliant. I finished in the top 5 percentile of the state for ancient history. But the presupposition was that miracles can't happen.
Right.
There was a philosophical assumption in terms of history that even in our class we weren't allowed to refer to history as BC or AD. It was before Common Era, BCE, or after Common Era or CE. Because to say AD was to say in the year of our Lord, and that would be to say that resurrection happened. And there was a fundamental presupposition by my teacher that dead people don't rise from the dead.
That's a pretty reasonable assumption to make.
It is a reasonable assumption to make if we have a presupposition that we live in a closed universe where there's not the possibility of the miraculous or a God intervening. But there's two things I think that there's strong historical evidence within and without actually the New Testament accounts. And two in particular, one is an empty tomb and the other one is witnesses. And if you just have an empty tomb, you can come up with all kinds of theories of stolen bodies. If you just have witnesses, you can talk about wish fulfillment, you can talk about deception and all kinds of things like that. But you put those two together, you put the empty tomb and witnesses together, and I think there are quite compelling reasons. And I wish I could have go back and catch up, have a coffee, a good Melbourne coffee, not a Sydney coffee.
Somewhere in Prahran, somewhere.
Somewhere in Prahran. I would love to sit down with Bruce Denner. I don't know where he is these days or what he's doing, but he is a brilliant historian. But I'd say, how do you account for the reality of the Christian church over the last 1,800 years if Jesus is just another dead Messiah? And there was plenty of them. In fact, there's still plenty of people claiming to be Messiah in Jerusalem today. The psych wards this time of year are full of Messiahs. But how do you account for the Christian church? Part of the problem is we think, well, we're sceptical and inquiring people these days. You know, if we had been there, we would have done the hard philosophical inquiry. We would have done the work. But back in those days, they believed in all kinds of fairy tales. You know, ancient people, they weren't very bright. I think one of the problems with that is it's historical snobbery. It says that we somehow are less gullible, are less sceptical, but actually in the worldview of the first century, people were just as sceptical about resurrection. So, for example, a Greek, to say to a Greek that Jesus had bodily risen from the dead was just a crazy idea to them. I mean, for a Greek, the body was perishing and lesser, whereas the spiritual was greater. And so when you died, you graduated from the body into the spiritual realm. Therefore, to say that you would die and come back and be given another body, they'd say, why on earth would you want to do that? You know, we're trying to escape the body. And therefore, to present to a person within the Greek worldview that Jesus had a bodily resurrection is just as implausible as it would be to a modern mind today. And the same for the Jewish people. Although they believed in resurrection, they believed that if there was a resurrection, it happened corporately to all people at the end of time. It didn't happen to individuals. To suggest that an individual had risen from death in the middle of history, they'd say, what do you mean? You know, like there's still injustice and there's still sickness and disease and there's poverty and God hasn't resurrected the whole of humanity at the end of time. So this is an implausible suggestion.
It's contrary
as well
to their prevailing expectations.
Yeah, so the resurrection worldview, the presentation of a resurrection in the first century would have met with just as sceptical minds. Hence the importance of actually an empty tomb and witnesses.
We've just seen the first witnesses here in this passage in Luke 24, that women turn up to the tomb. What do you make of the witnesses?
Well, again, if you were going to sort of make up a story, then you could have done a far better job than what the gospel writers have done.
If you were going to make it up, what would you do?
Well, you'd use someone who is credible. You wouldn't use a woman, would you?
Why not?
That sounds terribly rude, isn't it? In the first century, a woman was a third-class citizen. You could not use a woman's testimony in a court of law. You would be laughed out of court. Celsus, who is, I think he's a second century writer, he just said, look, women are no use to us in terms of testimony and witness. And so you think, well, if you're going to make up a story about a Messiah who's conquered death and risen from the dead and is bringing in this new world order, then you wouldn't use the testimony of women. You wouldn't make up a story that had women as the central witnesses to that story. And yet, within about 15 to 20 years of Jesus' death, you have people saying there are multiple attestations and witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus. And they were women. And you wouldn't make that claim unless it was just known to be true.
Even in the testimony where it says here that, but these words seemed to them an idle tale and they did not believe them.
Yeah.
So even the initial, they didn't believe these women.
I'm not going to listen to a woman, they'd say. But the thing is, within 15 years of the Christian message sort of going out and this news about Jesus, the conqueror of death, the one whom Thomas the doubter would say, my Lord, my God, immediately upon this news, people start worshipping him as God. And it would be very easy to actually go back to the sources and say, is this what happened? You couldn't change it. You could have said, well, let's doctor it up. Let's put some men into the account. But it was a story which was so well known that people would have known that you were playing with it. And so they just told the truth. Women saw the bodily resurrected Jesus first. It's actually a very compelling reason why we should believe the gospel accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. So again, you have an empty tomb. You have these witnesses, and not just these women, but the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the fact that there were multiple sightings by different people at different times in different ways. Some of whom, he says, probably 15 to 20 years after the resurrection event, he says some of whom may not still be alive, but many of whom you could go and meet with.
And talk to and have a coffee with.
Yeah.
In Prahran, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't like Greek coffee. It's a bit fine, but yeah.
Okay, well, given that there seems to be good reason that the resurrection actually happened, so what? What does it mean? And how does the resurrection offer hope?
I think this is a fundamental question. I'd answer it in two ways. One, it says that this body and this world is very important to God. Because the resurrection is about a bodily rising to new life. There is a radical transformation of the body of Jesus, so that all that spoils, all that destroys, all that corrupts has been dealt with. And so there's this hope of an existence, what the Bible calls a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth, where there is life that is unspoiled and unmarred by all that hinders us and hurts us in this life. And so the bodily resurrection of Jesus, it's not only hope for the future, but actually also says something about our bodies now. That this life is important. What we do now really counts. And God's not just going to throw it away. He's not just going to discard it and give us some kind of ethereal cloud kind of existence. See, for a Greek thinker at that time, that was a radical thought. Because the Greeks thought, no, you can do whatever you want in the body because it's a tent. It's just sort of passing on. When Jesus rises bodily from the dead, he says, no, this body that you've been given, it's a fundamental theatre in which life is lived. But one that can be lived in relationship to God, in relationship to the world, in relationship to people around us.
So we've been describing this as the week that changed the world. What is it about this message or this story that has changed the world?
Well, the Apostle Paul says, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then your faith is futile and you're still in your sin. It means that Christians are incredibly deluded people, possibly deceptive, and what we're doing now But not only that, there is an increasing amount of people who say it's not only deceptive and dangerous, but it's actually destructive. So
you could change the world for the worst.
it could actually be changing the world for the worse. And there'd be those today that would say Christianity is not a force for good; it's actually a force for evil. And I think Christians probably need to wear that on the chin a little bit and say, are we actually a force for good or a force for evil? But I think if you go to the very heart of the Christian faith, despite all the ways in which some people may say the Christian faith has let them down or not come through with the goods in the way they, it's whatever was on the label isn't actually what's in the packet, kind of thing. At the heart of resurrection hope is giving meaning to this life and giving us a trajectory into eternity, so that things like justice and truth and goodness and honesty are given a value that will be affirmed for all eternity, that won't just fizzle up and die with us and therefore are pointless, but they'll actually be affirmed as the very things that God has made us for.
So he's given us a new hope.
Absolutely, a hope that actually grounds, if you like, we can look back to the past and what Christ has done. We can look into the future in this new creation that God has promised and that Christ is the first fruits of. And that actually gives us a compass bearing for how we live now as people of justice and as people of love and as people of peace and integrity and truth. Because those things matter. They were demonstrated in the life of Jesus. They're fulfilled in this coming new creation. And that means how we live now is incredibly filled out and meaningful.
Today we've seen the first sightings of hope. Women have seen the empty tomb. Jesus has risen from the dead. The Logos for the day is, why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Please thank our guest today.
Thank you.
Shane Rogerson.